finding it harder and harder to know where to even start talking about the world's malaise. But I just want to touch on one area of our lives that I feel has got markedly worse over the years, and that's around accountability. And it's the one thing that has actually trickled down, and not in a good way, from the elite into our everyday lives. So much so that, I often feel, that the basic covenants or foundations by which we live our lives are sort of being decimated. We're sort of heading towards some form of, like sort of purge-like reality TV that doesn't really last 12 hours. It sort of becomes the norm. You might think that's being kind of melodramatic, that we're better than that, but really, when I think about the human cost of what happens next when politicians, corporations, and industries are allowed to bypass those sort of fundamental accountabilities, and that starts to creep into personal life accountability, I'm not sure that it is melodramatic. The base feeling that I get with all of this is kind of disappointment, and that's just the base level, and then it soon kind of elevates to anger and fear. And I'm very conscious of how this all plays, on my own mindset, and how I have to keep those sort of feelings in check and learn how to sort of deal with those. I'm also really interested in the link between accountability and disappointment. Do we have an aversion to accountability because we perhaps perceive there's too large a threat to us from not meeting those levels of accountability? And what are some of those threats? Conflict, blame, judgment, disappointment. My guest today has written a brilliantly ferocious, raging EP with her band Cathari, in which there's a lot of focus on her own disappointment at life, at ex-friends, and perhaps at herself. It's called "It Will Hurt the Entire Time You Are Alive," and this record, believe me, will really make a difference to your life. So, enough of me anyway, and it's my real honor to welcome Magdalena Stephens to the show. Maggie, thanks so much for coming on and giving us some time.
And thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Brilliant. So I was really glad to kind of receive your EP. The timing was really kind of great for me, because I've been around Europe with Def Club and a band called Fuck Money from Austin. We've been sort of through the UK, been at Roadburn Festival, blah blah, and listening to them sort of playing every night. There was just just some, like, it just made me feel like I came back from that just really intense, and like I need to get back to that more kind of like noisy music. And then lo and behold, your EP drops into me. Kind of serendipity or something like that.
Always appreciate it when music kind of finds me at the right time. I felt that way very much about Primitive Man. I found them at a very low point in my life, and I was like, just sounds like my skull's falling apart. I need this.
Skulls falling apart. Yeah, I think that kind of music sort of explains perhaps some of my. I think I noticed a few years ago. I got like, I was getting this sort of ringing in my ears, and I was like, oh, fuck, that's like tinnitus starting. And yeah, it's like, but still, I have to wear earplugs now at gigs, but there are still times when you just want to take them out and just sort of put your head in the speaker.
Oh yeah. Sometimes I wear earplugs religiously because I want to keep doing this even as I get older. But
Yeah,
sometimes I really want that feeling of like, oh, this hurts.
yeah,
There's something very like viscerally pleasing about it, especially with like live noise music. The
definitely.
almost pain of receiving the art is almost part of
Yeah.
it, which is it's a little bit lost with the nice earplugs, albeit the high def ones I find can almost
Mm.
capture that experience.
Yeah, no, I felt exactly the same. Like, so like with Def Club, for example, it was probably what, the 12th to the 26th, so probably about 2 weeks, and there's only one night off, and yeah, I find it myself. I have my earplugs and I'm like, okay, I just need to hear this again. That kind of discordance, some of the electronics going on and stuff like that, and yeah, it was just, there is something different. You do lose something, that like you say, that kind of visceral element to it, don't you? So tell us about the EP. So it's been out what about 2 weeks? About 2 weeks now, isn't it?
Give or take, yeah, I've lost
Yeah,
track of that.
yeah, I
I
bet.
decided to pick the release date around a show we got booked. We got booked with one of our prime influences, which is Intercourse from Connecticut.
Yeah,
Fantastic band, if you're not familiar.
yeah,
Um, and I kind of worked backwards, which wasn't really the right way to release an album, but beginner's luck, it all worked out. Um, I've honestly lost track of time since it came out, though. It was like
yeah,
everything revolved around the release, and then just after that, I just wasn't aware what week it was because it didn't matter anymore for a little bit, which has been freeing. But now I'm like ready to do the next album.
yeah. How did you? In the sort of the run up to it coming out, how were you feeling? Because of there's been perhaps like the personnel changes and then the stylistically some changes as well. How how were you feeling in that sort of run up?
I was feeling pretty good. I can't lie. We've had a lot
Mm,
of live shows that went very well with this material, and
yeah,
with the previous album we put out, it's hard to explain. It was like sunk cost fallacy turned into art. I had written a
right,
lot of those songs as far back as 2018, 2017. The pandemic interrupted everything. And
yeah,
eventually I had so much of this unreleased art that I went, oh, I have to finish this.
yeah,
But I just don't think my heart was in it. And when we went to play these songs live, we just didn't really get much of a reaction. It was surprising.
mm,
And since we started playing this new material, we started back in November, October of last year. We've just gotten fantastic crowd responses. People really like it. I
mm,
do some stuff that's only live, like harsh noise performances that people seem to gravitate towards instead of being scared off by. I was fully expecting to clear rooms, but instead I have people who are like 22 who have never seen this before being like, "This is amazing! I've never seen anything like that." And it's
yeah,
interesting. I've been able to almost touch an audience that's not really about this kind of sonic abrasion,
mm.
which it's been very interesting.
It's interesting that, isn't it? How your kind of fan or crowd demographic sort of changes. It sounds like it's brought in some new people.
Oh, a lot.
That's been quite noticeable, that sort of change.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like a lot more young people are listening to us, which is interesting because
Yeah,
we were starting to court like 27 and up crowd, which isn't that's not a bad thing, of course, whoever
yeah.
likes your music, but the switch just in the demographic data I have just from like Spotify has been like so dramatic, it's crazy.
Wow. Can you can you put your finger on why?
Um I think the message of like nihilistic bitterness about where society's going, about
Yeah.
how our inner lives are kind of becoming really empty and meaningless. I
Mm,
think it just resonates with young people. Like I, one of my first memories is literally 9/11.
yeah,
And that's the world I grew up in, and I'm almost 30 years
yeah.
old now. A lot of
Interesting.
these kids who were like 22, they grew up in a world where school shootings were constant in America. They
Yeah,
grew up in a world where, frankly, their lives have been cheapened to property. I didn't even
yeah,
feel that
yeah.
way as a child, but I can imagine if I were growing up right now, I might feel like, oh, I'm just property because of the
Mm,
way that now we're putting children back to work in America. Now we're doing all these things that are basically just devaluing them to like, oh, you're basically just capital that your parents own. And that
mm,
is so I can't even imagine the bitterness they must live with, the frustration of growing up in that kind of environment, now having your own agency and not really knowing
yeah,
where to go from here. And I think that message of like everything's fucked. How do we go from here?
yeah.
Really resonates with them in particular.
It's yeah. You bring up a good point there. I think about that. The world that you grow up in. Because I'm 56, so I grew up. I was so I would have been 12 in 1980, and then kind of getting that. So through the 80s was well, certainly the end of the 70s, begin up to the kind of mid, probably in 87, 88. There was all the kind of the Cold War. There was like in the from the UK, there was a really, right wing government, and a government that fucked people over like big time. And there was a whole kind of miners' strike and the stuff that really destroyed communities, and that stuff kind of stays with you. So thinking about, your generation, and then, the generation of, that are maybe, kind of 10, 11, 12 years old now, those kind of big events, I mean, they may be different, they may be the same, but they still have that kind of effect on you.
Oh yeah, they just change the way you look at the world.
Yeah,
Um, it's one thing to say, "Oh, this is a tragedy," every time something like that happens, but when it just keeps
yeah,
happening, you even as a child, you might be gullible, but you'll start to understand like they don't mean this. They don't
yeah,
think it's a tragedy because they're not doing anything about it.
yeah,
Because ultimately they care about donors more than they care about people. And
mm,
that's the world they grew up in. They grew up in the world after 2008. They decided
yeah,
corporations are people and they can advocate on behalf of the government. And
yeah,
it spiraled out of control. Now bribery is basically legal. All
yeah,
these things have just been omnipresent growing up, and they grew up with the internet, so they have more access to that information.
yeah,
I still remember a time when that wasn't fully ubiquitous, and I was looked at as a little weirdo for liking the internet so much,
yeah, yeah,
because it just wasn't the thing to do. People didn't have smartphones. We weren't always like just a touch away. It's almost unthinkable now, but I
mm,
still remember that they don't.
they don't.
And that's
Yeah,
something I found very difficult to like. I can't really understand that mindset myself because I do remember.
mm,
So all this stuff feels almost like a bad dream we can't wake up from, rather
yeah,
than
you're right.
this omnipresent aspect of reality where it probably just feels so normalized. It's not seen as like,
Yeah,
oh, it's this technology that changed the world 10 years ago. To them, it just is.
it just is. That is the
And
world.
that's strange to me.
Yeah, no, I
Like I
know what
hope
you
we can
mean.
come back from that.
Yeah, because I guess you've got kind of, so you're 30. You were born in what would that be? 90
95.
95. So you kind of crossed the kind of pre-internet and the sort of the internet, that sort of, that, yeah, you've got the both worlds,
Yeah, and
which is
it's an interesting
interesting.
experience. I don't really belong to either of the composite generations that people try to
Yeah.
establish. It's
Well,
I think those are very silly anyway, but
I mean, I'm trying to, yeah, sort of navigate both with my kind of like aging brain as well. Sort of, try, remembering that old world and then this world. But it's interesting you mentioned about your lyrics as well, and the, the themes that you're singing about, and that kind of touches on, it's a word that gets used a lot, and I have this thing about some words that they get used so much that their meaning starts to get, kind of diluted, or even kind of changed. But that's, relatability, the ability that, which is really what you're doing, relating to that kind of group of people, whether it's sort of, whatever kind of demographic it is, and that is hugely important, I feel.
I agree. I mean, I'm just being honest in the lyrics. The
Yeah.
fundamental driving force of writing this was just producing something that's as honest as possible.
Mm,
I try to capture the visceral kind of message of the music in the way I write it. Typically, I have lyrics first,
mm,
and that factored in a big way. Just I wrote with a different language. I didn't really think like I'm going to make a doom metal album.
yeah,
Um, and that's how I used to create. There's nothing wrong with striving to write a genre, but this was more just let what happens happen and then figure out what genre it is later. Um, and what came forth from that was just this very chaotic, undulating, irregular. There's no like 4/4 time until you get to more stable parts of the song. It just
mm,
reflects this like instability, this deep resentment and frustration in my life at the time, and
mm,
the lyrics also reflect that.
mm,
I mean, for example, the song Wait is about that internet reality that we now exist in, where these forces have been so like omnipresent for so long. People now see this
yeah,
voluntary surveillance state we all partake in as like another arm of the law, and people now involve like, oh, we had a bad breakup, and I feel some aspects of
Yeah.
our relationship were abusive. Now I'm going to talk about it on the internet for 3 years, even though we've kind of resolved the issue because I want somebody to be run out of town. And
Yeah.
then it
Yeah.
results in that person also taking their personal issues into the public eye. And before you know it, we're all concerned with our own like little Maury Povich show. And
Mm, mm,
it's ridiculous.
yeah.
It winds up there are people who are actually doing harm, say in Philadelphia, and a lot of the complaints about them get swallowed up in the midst of this, in the midst of like, so
Yeah.
and so is problematic because they made me do the dishes because we're roommates. Oh no.
Oh, yeah.
These it's like you said earlier, like words losing meaning, and a lot of this accountability language is being diluted into people who they just feel like their personal lives deserve this because we've been told for so long now that this is what you use the internet for. And it
Yeah.
just there's just a kind of disgust it fills me with when you try to abuse like trust that other people place in you. That if
Mm,
something wrong is happening, as your friend, I want to make it right and help you be safe.
yeah.
And that's the frustrating part. It's taking advantage of the fact that other human beings care about you to get even with somebody.
Mm,
And that just it's difficult to square that as a person who tries to be honest
yeah.
to other people, even if it's uncomfortable, because it's not an easier way to live either. It doesn't make
Mm,
sense to me other than just a desire to hurt people.
mm. I wonder
And
if there's this sort of, you know, the entitlement and privilege, which words that are sort of talked about, but that feeling that I'm entitled to feel this way and to talk this way and to take up that kind of space when it's really a kind of invasion. I do
in a way,
feel that
yeah.
there is an entire lot of privilege and entitlement that is around these days.
Oh, agreed. And it's often coming from people who I can't say this for sure, but I speculate maybe they don't have the range to understand that what they went through isn't like that's not
Mm,
a matter the community needs to be involved in. That was just a bad relationship, and now you're separated, and now you don't talk to each other, and so the
yeah.
problem's resolved. Or like,
Mm,
hey, you had a bad roommate that you didn't like. Now you don't live together. The problem is resolved. Instead,
absolutely.
these turned
Yeah.
into like grudge matches of people
Yeah.
being like, "Oh, I'm owed something for what I went through," and it's like, the reality is that person just didn't do the dishes enough. It's
Yeah.
not that big of a problem. It stinks, I get it. Being
It's
frustrated with somebody
shitty.
is being frustrated with somebody, for sure, but it's just this blurring of, like, what's a real problem and what's not really, a real
Mm,
problem that the community needs to be involved in. These are just personal disagreements that people have. And
mm,
I've seen just an abundance of it. I left behind a few friendships last year as a result of
mm,
it. Just people I'm like, well, I've had to answer for you so many times. I
mm,
don't want to justify being friends with you because you behave badly and now you're dragging people into like your
mm,
negativity, being accusing other people of toxic behavior when you're not acknowledging
mm.
your own. Like there's just so much of it, and it's strange. It doesn't get us anywhere.
For you doing that, so take, for example, the sort of the friendships and deciding or it evolving into, I'm not gonna, I need to exit these friendships or whatever, however you did it. Was there a moment, or is this been like a kind of evolution for you where there's kind of like growing sort of feelings that those friends that that relationship is not serving you?
Well, I mean, I don't love the phrase "the relationship isn't serving me" because a lot of people also distort that into like,
Yeah.
"What have you done for me lately?" Which
True,
I
true.
try not
Yes,
to
that's
be
true.
like that with friends as
That's very
well.
true, yeah. That's a fair point, yeah.
It really just most people that I wind up not speaking to anymore comes from a culmination of just I've had to answer for you to other people. I've
Mm,
had people asking me about you, um, or I've been involved in your interpersonal conflicts that I had no business being involved
mm,
in more than 2 or 3 times. We can have a
mm,
conversation about it, and I can say, "Hey, that wasn't right. You can't do that again."
yeah.
I'll give people a chance. I'm not a big fan of the whole chase people out of your life as soon as they show any sign of like being
Yeah.
human. I don't know how else to describe it, but
Yeah.
it's just eventually you realize like, oh, I get stressed out when I think about this person.
Mm.
I don't think that's really that's not your friend. That's a
Yeah.
person who stresses you out that you're like, oh, I still have to be polite to them.
It's very true that. Yeah. No, I can fully appreciate that. Wha going back to you know, we were talking about the you know, just earlier about those sort of bigger kind of global things that we live with. Go back to when you were growing up. I mean, what were the sort of the things that you remember as your formative, you know, influences, either, you know, kind of environments, people, events, whatever?
Um, I was a little bit more aware than I should have been of the world at a young age.
Mm,
My parents didn't really shield me from at least electoral politics in America.
mm,
So I was pretty aware of the fact that our invasion of Iraq and of Afghanistan was completely unjustified. Basically,
mm,
just I don't think they approached the point that it was a cash grab for oil to make companies profit, but
mm.
they were at least on board with like this is not justified. There's no reason to believe we should actually be doing this aside from war profiteering.
Yeah.
And I was aware of this at about the age of 8 or 9. Just
Mm,
that was very formative. Going, oh, this is what our government does at its worst.
yeah.
After
Yeah.
being told all my life, like, oh, America's so great, it's wonderful,
Yeah.
and living with that awareness while most other children were shielded from that was interesting. I mostly got out of grade school by the time school shootings became ever present, but they did happen. And that was something
Wow.
interesting. I never lived to see the like, we're going to teach you how to build barricades phase of this crisis.
Mm,
But I did see, they're doing nothing about this. It's happening over and over again. It doesn't matter what state. It's even happening in blue states, and they're doing nothing about it.
sure.
Um,
Yeah.
just seeing that over and over again and wondering, uh, is it going to happen near me? Is it going to happen to
Yeah.
some of my friends who go to different schools? I just don't know.
Mm,
Um, but I know back in the days of the Cold War, everybody was being told like, "Hey, you get nuked at any time.
yeah.
You just got to live with it. Hide under your
Yeah.
desk, Bucko. I'm sure that'll shield you from the thermonuclear hellfire. I'm sure it'll work." So I feel like that malaise isn't really new so much as it's just
Yes.
its new form.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very
I
true.
just I became aware that we were war profiteering. Life got really cheap, and it's never stopped getting cheaper since I was born. So I've mostly just resigned myself to being right about every time it gets worse. Because a
Mm,
lot of the time my family would not believe me, and they'd say, "You're being hysterical." I'd be like, "I'm just
mm.
following the patterns. This is what happens. You let it get worse, it gets even worse."
Yeah. What about what about, you know, about those sort of friendships, you know, and the sort of the people that you would, you know, kind of feel an affinity towards or kind of gravitate towards? What sort of people were you, you know, kind of friends were you hanging out with as you were growing up?
I didn't have many,
Mm,
admittedly.
mm,
Um, I grew up closeted for many years. I didn't
mm,
come out until I was much older, so
yeah,
I was just kind of the weird kid. I had
mm,
niche interests, like I was into death metal by the time I was like 14 years old, so
yeah,
I wasn't connecting with anybody on that basis. Even the other musician kids, they'd be
mm,
like, "What the hell's their deal?"
mm,
They wear these completely, unreadable band logos with gross graphics. I got sent home from
yeah,
school once or twice for shirts.
yeah,
Um, it was just, to be honest, it was kind of heartening years later to find out I kind of had the growing up metal fan experience where you grow up in a town that's not huge. You meet maybe three other kids who know what the hell you're talking about at any given moment, and
mm,
you hold on to those kids for dear life. And that happened. I've grown apart from many of the people I came up with for certain reasons,
mm,
some of which are just some of them probably don't believe that I'm a woman,
yeah,
and that's their problem, not mine.
yeah,
But that
absolutely.
was the experience typically, like just finding my people, even if my people were like 3 or 4 kids who had very disparate interests, but were
Mm,
still down to hang out with the weird kid who played metal.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's I totally hear you with that. It's an interesting one. I mean, I was, yeah, I kind of I grew up in quite a small town. I mean, I don't know any what the sort of population was, but for in the UK, it's sort of quite a small town. And then I got sort of separated from the friends that I had around about sort of 11 years old, and then found myself, okay, I've got to go, find new friends, and that wasn't that easy. I was always very shy as a kid. Very, I mean, my nature is sort of quite is an introvert, and it wasn't easy, and I felt certainly that from those friends that I got separated from, that it became a them and well, not even them and us, it was a them and me, sort of situation, and to kind of find people who you had that kind of affinity with, and music for me was a one of those things that I wanted to have an affinity with friends with, and it was I had a really really close friend who I then lost touch with for about 30 years, and then just for no other reason than probably my own laziness, but also I had an issue in my childhood which caused me some trust issues, and I think that was kind of part of it. Not with this friend, but kind of part of my whole kind of being. And so kind of finding your people, your tribe, if you want to call it that, is kind of really important. And like you say, kind of clinging on to them, when you find people, it's very powerful, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and I mean, I felt that way much more deeply when I moved to Philadelphia and started meeting
Mm,
people who were a lot more interested in the same things as me. Like,
yeah.
oh, they know what grindcore is, they know what power violence is. They're not just aware but
Mm,
enthusiastic. Um, and those were the people that I was suddenly like, oh my god, please never leave. This is the greatest thing ever. I
yeah,
didn't know there were even more than like 200 people who care about this stuff,
yeah.
which I feel like that should be self-evident, but I guess growing up in a
It's not.
smaller area, you just assume that it's extremely niche, even in a big city.
Mm,
And that was wonderful. Meeting people who could play on the level that I could play was wonderful. I had some
mm,
friends back in my hometown who definitely could keep up, but like the average musician I know now is so good at what they do, and
mm,
I sometimes lose track of that, like, every single one of my friends is incredibly talented. They're not just, like, a guy who picked up a guitar. They're, like, they've been nurturing this talent for, a decade. They've been
mm,
nurturing this talent for, 2 decades, depending on the person,
yeah,
and that the difference is just so much better. Like, these are people who are kinda, like, locked in and ready to play as opposed to I kind of want to start a band because I saw some footage of Thin Lizzy playing, and I
yeah,
decided I wanted to be a rock star.
yeah,
Which that's fine, play guitar if you want to play guitar, just for fun. Have your rock star fantasy, but these are people who get the reality that we're not going to be rock stars, but it's still worth doing because it's just the most fun thing in the world.
yeah.
That's been the most positive constant in my life, has been playing extreme music. I started
Mm,
performing live when I was 14,
mm.
um, and I've been
When
doing
what?
it fairly.
I'm sorry
I've,
to
I've been
interrupt.
doing it fairly consistently since I think I had a break from like age 16 to 17 or 17 to 18.
Mm,
There was like a year or two I didn't play any shows, but I think I've played at least 5 or 6 shows at a minimum every
mm.
year of my life. Since age 14, now it's usually like many double digits because I'm in a couple of bands, but I just try
Wow.
to grow that every year.
When did you start playing? I mean, when did you sort of first pick up, the guitar?
So when I was 8 years old, a friend of mine from elementary school, I was hanging out at his house, and
Yeah.
his dad busted out a headless bass guitar
Right.
and just invited me to strum on it alongside his son and stuff. And I like picked it up immediately and kind of understood how it was supposed to work.
Yeah.
Um, I was playing offhand because I'm left-handed. Never corrected that. It
Mm,
just felt very natural. And suddenly it was just this thing that like everybody responded well to when I did it. I just suddenly had this magic tool that made anybody think like, oh, this person's pretty cool.
Yeah,
And I really liked doing it. So it just became this. I picked it up and put it down 100 times. I started guitar when I was 9,
yeah,
and I've just been playing pretty consistently since the age of like 13 or 14 to
yeah,
now. Both instruments and synthesizers and vocals and
and
anything I
vocals.
can I can actually manage. I cannot drum. So bad at it. But everybody has to have, something they're terrible
Something they're not
at.
good at, yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. There's the admission. There's the challenge as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, one day I want to maybe be able to play drums. I don't think I'd
Oh,
be
yeah.
able to do it like very effectively, but if I could get my feet to work, maybe.
So
But yeah, it's been a long time.
so what can you, because I've thought about this, because like my so when I was a kid, I was classically trained. I played the cello from 8 to 16, right? And, I did all my exams, and I was good, but, uh, for the longer that I was playing it, and it probably sort of coincided with transition into teendom, that I felt like I was being pressured into it, that I didn't own the thing, so I became resentful of doing lessons. My dad wanted me to do lessons, blah, 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 and it was just like I was being dragged away from that. So my first love of music was, getting into the Ramones, getting into, kind of things like Bad Brains and Husker Du and so forth. And then I got into the later 80s into things like, kind of like Extreme Noise Terror and Napalm Death, and a lot of that early, kind of grind music, as well as Public Enemy. So it became quite diverse. But I've always tried to work out why I was drawn to that sort of music.
I know it's such a mystery, isn't it?
It's a mystery. The only so the only thing I can put it on for myself is that I saw that music as being rebellious, kind of like a bit sort of, paddling against the tide. And that's what I was trying to do with this cello thing that was starting to become quite consuming in my life. That's the only thing I can kind of work out.
I mean, it makes sense. I definitely like that a lot of people I felt were full of shit growing up would be like, "Ooh," when they heard the music that I like. It was kind of like what do they call it when you have bright colors to warn predators that you're poisonous? It was kind
Oh,
of the same thing. Like,
yeah, like
all right, here's my
Chameleon-esque or something,
armor.
isn't it? Yeah, yes, yeah.
But also I remember hearing like a blast beat for the first time and being like, "What in the hell is happening? This is incredible. I have never heard anybody do that before. That is wild." I think
Yeah.
the first I heard was a Black Dahlia Mother song. Trying to think.
Okay.
I'm one of those weirdos who got into a lot of the more extreme stuff through like finding
Yeah.
memes on the internet and going, what is this? This is incredible. And then going and listening to the album, like I found Job for a Cowboy that way many years
Yeah.
ago. Like a video of like SpongeBob performing a song or something, which, I was 12, 13. This is what comedy was on the internet at the time.
Yeah.
It's funny to admit now, but I was almost embarrassed about it years ago. Just like, oh yeah, I
Yeah.
found I found heavy metal music through internet memes and listening to Motorhead and like White Zombie with my dad.
It is weird. It's funny, isn't it? That again, that thing that you have something that the reality. Okay, this is how it was. That you kind of like initially sort of quite embarrassed by it, and then later on when it's kind of past, it's okay. Okay, I can talk about it now. I feel comfortable talking about it. It's a weird kind of thing that we have.
Yeah, and I don't know when that changed. Yeah, it's kind of
No.
implacable. I think maybe just now that I'm not at the age where I care if people think I'm the
Yes.
coolest person ever, now I'm like, oh yeah, I found out about music through internet memes. It's fine. I didn't go to a club. I don't have a mysterious origin story. I was just a kid on the internet.
Now that's an interesting point that you raised, that about uh, not caring what people think. I mean, what was did you used to care about what people think
Oh, a lot. I mean, I
a
think I
lot?
think everybody goes through that when they're in their young adulthood. They
Mm,
suddenly have this drive to justify, like, "Oh, I'm a grown up now. You need to
yeah,
like me. I'm charming. I'm cool. I'm like,
yeah,
I'm so great. I have it all figured out." Especially when you're like 22 or 23, you have it all figured out, or so you think.
yeah, yeah,
And it's endearing now when I run into it, but it's definitely something that's faded over time when I realize, like, oh, everybody else is this like attention
yeah,
deprived child inside trying desperately to be the coolest person,
yeah,
and eventually it stopped appealing to me. People
yeah,
will like me if they'll like me, and they won't if they won't. Um, all I have to do is keep putting myself out there.
yeah. I remember I had in an older podcast. It was with Cynthia Slay from the Bush Tetras, and she's just so brilliant. And I was saying about myself. I I, uh, I spent a lot of my life bothered about what other people think. It's so draining and it's so pointless. But sometimes you it took me a while to get over that. But so I told her this, and she said, "Oh, just wait till you get to 66. You just do not give a fuck by then."
I can't wait.
That is so liberating.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, I'm already at the point where like some young people look at me and go, and I'm like, great. You don't think I have to be cool now? That's awesome. I can dress how I want. I can play the music I want. Nobody can say anything about me that I have to regard. If you make
Yeah.
fun of me, I go, okay.
So what was it like going back to like when you first played live? What what was going through your mind? Did you have like a lot of self belief as to what you were doing? And
um,
how does that play out now?
I was a bit of an anxious wreck performing probably for the first
Yeah.
5, 7
Mm,
years of doing it.
mm,
I don't actually know what kept me coming back because I would have like a veritable panic attack on stage like every time
yeah.
I performed.
Mm,
The just, oh my god, am I playing this right? Am I in time with the drummer? I'm so terrified. I was playing in like a melodic death metal band when I was 15.
mm,
The first show I played though, it was like it was almost cartoonish. If you want to say I have an origin story, this is probably it.
right.
Um, I was a 14-year-old who was given special permission to play this bar. I don't think I ever went back to that bar in Trenton.
Mm,
Um, and in this bar in Trenton, New Jersey, I meet all the other bands. They're all just kind of like, "There's kids booked on this show." They weren't rude to us, but they were very confused looking. And we played, and they were really enthusiastic about it. But at some point in the night, I just heard some screaming, and I had never been in a bar before because I'm a teenager. And I look
mm.
to my left, and one guy just breaks a pool cue over another guy's back. Um, just the most like cartoon bar fight thing you can imagine. And
God.
my all of my bandmates were standing in the same like little corner, and we both all just looked at each other like, did you just see that?" And the bartender like came over to apologize to us for what we just dealt with after kicking the one guy out. He took like a lap around the pool table and left after having his shirt ripped off or something. It was
Oh my
just
God.
so, it was like ridiculous. And I've never seen a bar fight like that since in all the years I've been playing, dives
Yeah.
here, abroad, anywhere. I've never seen anything that cartoonish and ridiculous. And this happened at maybe 6:30 p.m. on like a Friday night in the middle of
Oh
Trenton, New
my.
Jersey. It was so strange. But
Wow.
it just, something about it made me fall in love with it. I just
Yeah.
really liked getting up there and doing the performance. I liked getting over the fear of dealing with
Mm,
what people think, the anxiety of like, am I going to do this right? Can I do this? It gave me a lot of self belief when I was younger, at least in the sense of that when it was done, it was like, oh, I accomplished that. That's another thing I can say. Like, I got over my fear. I breathed deeply and I did it, even though I'm
mm.
terrified. And nowadays, that fear just kind of it doesn't surface so much as I get this like physiological response where I just get a massive adrenaline rush like right before I'm about to go on, and I just go on
Mm,
autopilot. Like,
yeah.
and it's almost like the fear has been conquered and circumvented into this like advantageous response instead.
You may now this reminds, sorry to name drop, but I think but it is relevant. I like I think my third podcast episode was Jennifer Finch from L7, and she said that she used to get massive anxiety, like to the point where it was like I can't go on stage. And so she was talking to, I think, a therapist about it, and the therapist sort of reframed, said, think about your anxiety as an energy. It's the energy that you need to be able to get on stage.
Yep.
Since thinking of it that way, which it sounds very similar to what you've done there.
Yeah, I mean, I think hers is a more intentional response. Mine
Mm,
is more like mind over matter. I can do this.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but a lot of my life has been getting over being afraid of things in
Mm,
order to be a happier person. So
mm,
that's story of my life. Aside from the disappointment stuff I write about.
yeah. Yeah, that obviously, I mentioned that in the intro. The sort of the disappointment. I mean, what role? So, what role does disappointment play? But how do you feel that you need to move past disappointment, or
Um,
is this kind of part of life?
I think disappointment can be a healthy thing.
Mm,
I think it can tell us when we're not in the right place. I think
yeah.
it can tell us a lot about how we truly feel, and about what we really need in life.
Mm,
So a lot of the disappointment I felt that I drew from with this record, like the first song is about the endless rat race of booking shows and how if you're not in the right club, in the right clique, you're going to have a harder time getting
harder
a
time.
show anywhere that's good in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
It's I just lost my train of thought. Sorry.
No, no, that's okay.
It's just about that generalized sense of it it kind of was a warning to me. Like I think I was trying to promote my act in the wrong scene, and when I kind
Mm,
of moved somewhere else and
yeah,
asked some different bands, they were a lot more enthusiastic and a lot more like, "Oh, you're doing this kind of music now? That's awesome. Let's book a show."
yeah.
And that disappointment led me somewhere better.
Somewhere
It's the
better.
same thing
Yeah.
with the third track. Wait, it's basically just a vitriolic critique of somebody I don't like, turned
Mm,
into like a composite from a couple people. But
mm,
it's that same. Oh, I'm just not in the right place in this friendship. I need to get out of here.
yeah.
Um, it's not about abandoning things all the time, but I think that disappointment can be like a healthy response before you really deal with like the anger or the sadness you feel about a situation,
Yeah.
because it's so pointed and so easy to identify, I feel.
Mm. Yeah, I guess it's, yeah, I mean, that's interesting because I mean, disappointment and those kind of feelings that we get, those emotions that sort of rush up. I mean, they're almost, they're starting. I mean, they're unavoidable. You feel that. You feel that you can't stop it, but your response to it is kind of the key, isn't it? And I
Oh,
like
exactly.
I like what you're saying there about to taking that, admitting that yes, we get these negative feelings. How do I use that to turn it around into the positive?
Oh yeah, I mean the title track is about how I likely had a personality disorder when I was younger, and it's about the cycles I would undertake where I would make people hate me just to justify my own self-image of like, oh, I'm
Mm,
not a good person.
mm,
And I wouldn't even really do this consciously. It's just something that like I realized looking back many years, ago now, that just like it was definitely driven by a desire to actualize how I felt about myself.
mm.
And when I changed how I felt about myself and tried to break that cycle actively, acknowledging it actively, it changed for the better. And I started to become like a happier person.
Mm,
And I use that song as the self-titled for that exact reason, because that's something I can't just run away from.
mm,
It's not something that it's not something that I can just put away and ignore forever. It's something I had to face in order to be alive today, frankly.
mm,
So it works really well with that thesis of like it will hurt, but you will probably learn from that pain, if nothing
yeah.
else.
You this is sort of going into the like an area that I'm really interested in, which is the sort of the emotional intelligence and self awareness. To be able to do that, and awareness that you need to kind of face those uncomfortable situations, which are difficult, and I think a lot of people will do shy away from those difficult and uncomfortable situations, whether it's for themselves or with others.
Oh, and I fully agree. And people like to point to the quote unquote instant gratification economy as this net negative force in society, but often it works
Mm,
as a smokescreen to kind of
mm,
discuss what it's actually harming, because our desire for instant gratification, I think, often shields us from doing the work that would lead us to much happier existences.
interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
the ability that I have to go on Instagram and find something that's at least aesthetically pleasurable and yada yada yada, interact with it, just scroll through thousands of colors and mindless entries. And there's some very good things being posted on there as well, but it's just so easy to ignore
Mm,
something negative. It's so easy to just take the drug, to just log in, to just tune into to whatever shuts all the thoughts out in your head, but it's still there. And I think a lot of people don't reckon with that fact. A lot of people who have been in similar shoes as mine, like I'm a recovering alcoholic. Um,
mm,
Unfortunately, that's a lifelong struggle.
mm,
Um, but it was better to not just reach for the beer than it was to live the rest of my life completely miserable, not accomplishing anything that I set out to, kind of trying to find reasons that life wasn't working out for me instead of it's the
mm,
booze. I'm
mm.
sure it wasn't all the alcohol, but it definitely didn't
Certainly plays
help.
a part. Yeah.
And forcing myself to confront, like, okay, this is just a negative force in my life. It is not going well.
Mm,
Every time I try to interact with this, it goes terribly wrong.
yeah.
Um, that I think, while it was awful and it hurt and it was uncomfortable, and I remember shaking in my
Mm,
bedroom in the middle of the winter in 2021. My roommate had COVID and I couldn't really leave and just
yeah.
suffering. But it was better than going out to the store and buying a beer, because all I would do is just set that back the next day.
Mm,
And eventually it became a mortal concern.
mm,
You drink enough, you throw up in your sleep, it's over.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and unfortunately, I almost faced that about 4 times before I quit. And
yeah,
that was kind of a wake up call to me, like the fourth time, because I had actually started to care a little bit about my life by that point. The
yeah.
first 3 times, though, it just astounds me that I didn't wake up that morning and go, it has to stop now.
Mm,
But it wasn't until I got the courage to face the discomfort of like, I'm really sick, I need help,
yeah.
that I actually was able to face it. It's the old adage, like the first step to solving the problem is acknowledging you have one.
Mm,
And
mm,
it's so easy to ignore anything.
yeah. I mean, I quit 5 years, almost 5 years ago. Um, I didn't have the experiences that you have had, but I did have, experiences where it's like, okay, I need to, given my makeup, my tolerance, or my whatever, I knew that I should stop, and I did. So I totally hear you, with that. Um, thank God you did, and you're flourishing now. And one thing I learned was that I learned to trust myself a lot more than I did. And, I'm not sure if I'd be doing this now if I'd have carried on. This
Oh
sort of
yeah.
thing, doing my writing, the whole kind of creativity thing, and stuff.
It takes a lot of work and a lot of follow through, and I think somebody who's indulging in that consistently can often lose sight of how much they're missing doing and how
Yeah.
unproductive they are because you can just enjoy another sip of the drink that makes you not care.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. What does what does instinct what role does instinct or uh, have for you? Well, what does instinct mean to you?
Um, I guess as an artist, it's trusting that your brain can come up with something that sounds good after the first thing you did that sounds good,
Mm,
and not questioning it too much
mm,
because that's something I've seen a lot of artists do where they try to write something and they have this perfect loop or this perfect riff and they're so excited about it.
yeah,
And then they just can't find their way to that second one because it has to be perfect.
perfect.
But the thing is, there's probably a part of your favorite song that you don't remember. There's probably just like a little tidbit, just some small detail that's not actually that memorable, even if the gestalt, like the whole thing is fantastic, even if it's like just utterly beautiful. I find
Yeah,
new layers in some of my favorite pieces of music when I listen to them.
yeah.
You're just not going to hear it all, especially if it's
Mhm.
complex, and that's okay. And it's good to
Yeah.
have that perspective because you don't wind up trapped. You can kind of go on the instinct like, "This is good enough. Let's move on to another moment."
Mm,
Because if every moment in your song is perfect too, there's not going to be very much like emotional movement. It's not going to have its ups and downs. It's just going to be
yeah,
like all on all the time, which is fine if you're going for that. But if you're not, like Fedash or other incredibly like just powerful bands that can manage that, it may not turn out great.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I totally hear you on that. I mean, sometimes I find when I'm doing, I mean, d for this podcast and for my writing, I do a lot of the, sort of graphic design now, and, I'd never really done it before until a couple of years ago and started getting interested in it, and, I mean, sometimes good not knowing the rules because then you kinda don't know when you're breaking them, do you? But and mine's by no means, I don't want it to be perfect, but I do find myself, I think perhaps because of my part of my nature, that I find myself, like, noodling around with little things, and then I'll look at it and think, "You've completely fucked this up. It looks far worse now. Just delete, delete, like, undo, undo, undo." And I was just like, "Learn." Just, sometimes when it kind of feels right, stop. Don't try to then add little bits in or, mess around with it. It's not gonna work.
Oh yeah, that's
And it doesn't
valuable.
matter as well.
Like throwing things away is so valuable as an artist.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it hurts because like that's a part of you. You're pushing away, but I've thrown out easily like 2 or 3 songs just of this new batch that I've been working on.
Mm,
I'm writing another album already, and I think I've thrown out like 2 or 3 songs in that one already.
yeah.
Just sometimes you write lyrics that you think are great when you're very emotional and you're feeling it. I write lyrics often when I'm at my lowest, almost as a format of journaling.
Mm,
And then I come back and edit later when I'm not as, what's the word? Emotional, that just very full of like,
mm,
self-pity or anger or something like that, when of a calmer mind. But
interesting. Yeah.
sometimes you go
Yeah.
back when you're in a good mood and you read the lyrics and you go, "Oh, boo-hoo." And when I have that reaction, I usually just throw the song away, or like when I try to write music to it and I go, "This doesn't really this doesn't spark joy."
Yeah.
I'll throw it away. I've written entire instrumentals that I just decided later like, "Oh, this sounded really cool when I was writing it in my console, but I was also stoned and
Mm,
it was the middle of the afternoon on the weekend and I was having a really good day, so I was just in a good mood." And then I come back to it later and I'm like, this is impenetrable. This is not going to be intelligible even if we put drums under it. I don't want to produce this into a song.
yeah.
Um, and just the act of like tossing out can be so helpful.
Do you with your, lyrics or music or whatever, or even other things that you might be working on outside of music, but, sort of show those to other people and, ask for their sort of comments on it. And if you do that, if they would make suggestions, as to perhaps how they would sort of see it changing. But I mean, how does that make you feel? And I'll tell you the reason I asked that, because I, for quite some time, sort of found myself being quite spiky. If somebody would perhaps critique something that I've been working on when I felt quite attached to it.
It's hard to take sometimes, especially if you are really attached to like a moment in the song that the other
Mm,
person goes, "Ah, this is you should change this to something else." Maybe because they
yeah.
don't envision it the way that you do yet.
Mm,
I try to keep that gap in mind that
mm,
when I'm writing, I'm almost envisioning like a really big moment with one of the punchline lyrics or something like,
yeah.
and wait, I won't ever make the same mistake with you. The repeating kindness thing. I almost built the song backwards from that
Mm,
moment because it just feels like it just felt like, oh, this is exactly what this song needs. Let's figure out how we get there.
yeah.
So I try to keep in mind, like, if I show this to somebody who doesn't have that vision in their mind, they're not going to hear that big moment.
True.
And I deliver lines in a very rambling way. It's just part of my influences.
Mm,
And so sometimes that doesn't translate great across just
mm,
text. So I try to keep that in mind as well.
yeah.
But sometimes people say, hey, this line's really, it's almost funny unintentionally. And I feel sad when somebody
Yeah.
says that, but also I really value that critique because sometimes it's just you get so excited about something you don't think about how it might work out once you actually create it into a full piece.
Yeah. With the change in sound, did that feel like you were taking a risk in any way?
Um, Not really. I mean, Cathari's always been my project. It's been kind of like I started out as this artist called Gossamer.
Mm,
We got offered like a distro deal with a label, and they were based out of Ohio. And there was already a band called Gossamer who played goth rock out of Ohio, and we
mm,
were playing like doom rock, so it wasn't that far off. It felt
yeah,
odd to have the same name. I felt like we were going to start competing for, yeah, people wondering like which Gossamer is it. So
yeah,
we changed the name eventually, but I don't know. I wasn't very nervous. I was kind of just like, we're gonna scare away a bunch of people, and we're gonna invite a whole bunch more.
mm,
And some people who are already really in this with us, who already like my message of like message and feeling above all else while I'm writing, they'll probably still enjoy it and follow.
yeah,
And some of our more devoted fans have absolutely really like taken to it.
mm,
We have this awesome dude in Argentina named Marcus. Shout out Marcus.
yeah,
And he was really enthusiastic to hear the new songs, even after he really liked our last album, and it was like night and day. But I mean, I think the spirit of the way I try to present music kind of works no matter what genre you put it in. It's I write lyrics. I
absolutely.
have this like big, powerful, punishing moment in mind, and I kind of work out how the song should get to that point. Or maybe I have a bridge in mind that's just spectacular. It's just really exciting, and then I figure out, the beginning and end to that.
Mm,
Just it's the same approach, even though we changed styles. I just found myself less constrained to the way I was trying to write.
yeah. That again is another interesting point around the sort of the constraints that you sort of perhaps feel or don't feel, and that, I wonder if it's comes, confidence, self-belief, and also, the kind of the innate desire to um keep your own creativity, sort of fresh and alive, rather than sort of staying I mean, of course, if you want to stay the same, that's totally fine, but also there shouldn't be fear of changing, of doing something different. And I hear, a lot of people, well, this thing of sort of comparing records to previous ones, which I understand it's a natural thing to do, but at the same time, it's not particularly helpful because I feel, you know, everybody's on their own journey, and I like, as a listener, I like to see a record as being a document at a particular sort of point in time of those creators' lives. That's where they're kind of at.
I agree. I think that's like a really I think if you're just thinking as like a creative person, that's just objectively correct. An album
Mm,
can't really be unless it's like a best of collection, which that's not what we're
mm,
talking about. It
mm,
can't really be anything else. It's what were you feeling at the time? What was going on in your life? What did you witness? What did you read about? All of that has an influence in what you're doing. And I mean, I'm writing some new stuff, and there's this small trickle of new metal influence sliding in that I'm like,
mm.
where is this coming from? I
Coming from
can't.
interesting.
I listen to System of a Down, so there's a little bit of that, but
Yeah,
it's also just it's a lot heavier than I expected. But I'm also not trying to be anything specific.
yeah,
Um, just letting it be. I think more artists need to just write music for 5 or 10 years, write a genre, write punk rock, write death metal, write grindcore, and then one day just start a project where you just write,
mm,
and you'll come up with something brilliant. All of the bands that I think are my favorite are probably just artists doing that. Like Portrayal of Guilt, that's like their whole origin story. They were a bunch of guys
yeah,
in really great screamo bands. They
yeah,
formed this utterly impossible to describe fantastic group that has just made incredible album after incredible album. They don't give a damn if it's like the same genre
mm,
every record. It's just whatever they want to do. And like for example, Devil Music, it's an EP that's just deranged, and then they have a string quartet version of the same EP with the
yeah,
vocals.
yeah,
And that's like the level of creativity I would encourage with people who are experienced. Just write. Just let it happen, see what happens, fill in every crack you can with content that feels right, make music that you wanna listen to personally, and
mm.
somebody will probably be really into that too.
You reminded me. I did a few years ago. I did a. It was during COVID, and we were for this kind of like arts lab. We were doing some, kind of like online workshops and things like that around different kind of creative uh, processes or things, I suppose. And one of them was a stream of consciousness writing with a lady called Laura Odell, who was married to Genesis Peorage from Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV for a while, and she started doing this sort of stream of consciousness writing. And she started it out as this as a series of workshops. She was doing it as her business. Let's call it a business, but for sort of women who um, had suffered trauma and did not feel that they were able to get to the depths of their subconscious, to this stream of consciousness writing, and it was incredible. Literally, kind of like a couple of prompts to start with, and then just write whatever comes. Don't stop, just write. It's
Yep.
incredible, incredible
It's,
the shit that's in there that comes out.
I think it's one of the most effective ways to be radically honest with yourself.
Mm,
So when I'm feeling, a lot of times I access really dark parts of my early life. As a
mm,
closeted person, there's just a lot going on there inside that
yeah,
is hard to articulate until you've been away from it for a few years. And you
mm,
have, I guess, the emotional range and maturity. I feel like people who don't get to become more self-actualized wind up in kind of a state of emotional stasis because a lot of people who don't get to do what I did, for example, who are similar to me, might feel like their life is probably going to end early or it doesn't really matter. I grew up with that sense of nihilism until I finally decided to make the uncomfortable but good choice to transition.
yeah, yeah,
So when I access those dark I usually find myself sad. I access a really dark place from my past that
Mm,
just reminds me of what I'm sad about.
mm,
And often I find this incredible insight that I had never previously thought about,
mm,
like coincidences or aspects of things that happened to me where my memory of it is almost blurry, but when I access it in this like poetic stream of consciousness state, I'm able to just glean more details and get more insight. Almost thinking about it with the brain I have now, but re-experiencing it at least as I remember it, because memory is of course imperfect.
yeah,
But it's just been this really valuable tool to
I
dig
bet.
deeper. Like I've been writing a lot about like drug abuse and self abuse and stuff like that because I'm pretty much past that point in my life. But
Mm,
some of the stuff I'm uncovering, I'm like, oh my god, I was
wow,
a miserable person. It
wow.
shocks even me sometimes. And I find myself when I'm editing, I'm like, did I really mean that?
Mm,
It leads to a lot of like reflection, a lot of later on, just taking a look and going, is that real or was I being melodramatic?
yeah, yeah,
And a lot of the time I'm finding the insight is just very real, and it's something I'm now allowing myself to feel or allowing myself to understand because I have the knowledge of like maybe what was going on with me at the time now.
mm. I mean, that must be very liberating,
Oh,
you
it's
know,
wonderful.
and you know, the feeling of weight, you know, sort of being lifted as these things start to become unearthed.
It's incredibly helpful. It goes back to that adage we spoke about earlier. The first step to acknowledging and solving a problem is, well, the first step to solving a problem is acknowledging that you
Is
have one.
acknowledging. Yeah.
And just finding that, like, oh, maybe I carry this deep seated feeling because of something that happened to me when I was 13. Maybe I
Mm,
carry this distrust of others because of something that happened to me when I was in high school. Just
yeah.
all of these things that suddenly make so much more sense now that I'm more in tune with who I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Um, and it's extremely liberating. It's been probably, to be honest, it's been a deeper, satisfying emotional work than like going to therapy was.
Yeah.
I still kind of want to go back because look at the world we live in. However, it's at least a crutch I can rely on right now to process the world, my past, the things that I've already experienced, the things that I fear are coming.
Mm,
All of that. Just it's wonderful. I fully believe in that method being like. I think it has some sort of like psychological benefit that we don't fully understand yet because I'm just
mm,
drawn to keep doing it.
mm. That's fascinating, Maggie. Brilliant. I think that might be a wonderful place to stop.
Okay.
It's been terrific. It's been so good to talk to you. So good.
Likewise, this has been a really interesting conversation. I
Yeah.
enjoy when I get to talk about like the how and the why of art instead of like, oh yeah, you also like Napalm Death? Yeah, like that's great, but it's nice to talk about art for art's sake too.
For art's sake, and sort of go into the yeah, I'm just really interested in the getting to know and sort of understand, getting sort of underneath, you know, as to the whys and the, you know, kind of what you're feeling when you kind of go when you're doing things, when you're going through things, and yeah, you know what's made you, you know, who you are now. I think it's fascinating, and but thanks for, you know, a wonderful chat and being so open about things. It's been really terrific.
Oh, of course. I like to only take interviews if they're interesting because I've been asked some really inane questions that I just wind up shrugging and giving almost a fake answer. So it's wonderful to be able to be so open and be unapologetic about it.